Um, within the Economic Policy Centre, there are a number of people who work and who have been involved at every level in policy making and policy thinking and evidence gathering. No one more so than Esmond Birnie. He has a long history of public service, but came to Ulster University as a senior economist. And we asked Esmond just to take a listen to what Gareth said and to respond to some of the points he makes and to comment from his angle about some of the most important things to take note of. So Esmond, you're very welcome, and we look forward to what you have to say. Hi.
Okay, is that now?
That's good.
Yeah, technology is a wonderful thing if one understands it. Okay, thank you very much. I agree with what Gareth has been saying. If anything, I would probably put the threat from inflation even higher. Two reasons for that. One being what's happening currently in the United States economy, particularly in terms of the gigantic scale of the spending plans of the new administration, President Biden's administration. And secondly, we're going to have the legacy effect of the enormous expansion, and it has been enormous, gigantic again, of the money supply through quantitative easing, not just by the Bank of England, our own central bank, but the European Central Bank, US Fed Reserve, Bank of Japan, etc. Now, in terms of the sectors, and Gareth quite rightly took a sectoral approach, and in particular with reference to aerospace, I think the prospects and challenges and opportunities facing that sector can be illustrated by three particular case studies that came to the fore in the last week or so. So first of all, we heard from Airbus that they are talking about upping the production of the A220, the narrow body, small passenger jet, and of course that if those plans come to fruition, that will be very valuable to the Belfast operation, Spirit Aero Systems, because they manufacture the wings for the A220, and about 1,000 out of the 3,000 jobs in the former Bombardier are related to that. So that's good news. But the bad news, of course, was a further reduction in employment in aircraft seat manufacturing at Thompson's in the Craigavon area. 200 jobs going on top of earlier reductions previously last year. The third example, again, is an interesting one, and it illustrates the complexities of what's going on. Demroy Plastics, a manufacturing company based mainly in the Bangor area, North Ireland. They make a diverse range of products, everything from hairbrushes to components for the Typhoon fighter jet. And they've managed to diversify further beyond aerospace. They received a contract for making personal protection equipment, so obviously using an opportunity created by the public health challenges. Now, additionally, I want to talk in the remainder of this short comment time about three other sectors. Now, given the lack of time, I'm not going to be saying anything about some very important sectors, for example, ICT and cybersecurity, which has been highlighted by the Department for the Economy as one of the 5 key business clusters for Northern Ireland for the future. And similarly, I'm not going to be dealing with fintech, financial services technology, important though that obviously is. But let me say a little bit about agri-food, or indeed agri-tech, as the Department for the Economy recently referred to it. Now, this is a large sector, relatively speaking, in Northern Ireland compared to the rest of the UK or in many other Western economies, although we do need to put that into perspective. Total contribution to Northern Ireland's GDP is somewhere between 4 and 5%. So that means obviously that 95 to 96% of our economy isn't in agri-food. But nevertheless, it is a bigger sector here than across the Irish Sea. It has been perceived, especially in the last 2 decades, as a key and successful sector. And I suppose there is a sense in which the pandemic and other developments in the world economy, to the extent that there's now much more nervousness about relying on long supply chains, means that there will be an increased emphasis on all dimensions of food security, and that will be helpful in terms of demand and promoting demand for Northern Ireland-based agricultural and processed food products. But more negatively, the level of productivity, particularly in farming, is relatively low by UK average standards. Up till now, and indeed up till the end of this Parliament, the UK government is underwriting the previous level of farming subsidies associated with the EU's Common Agricultural Policy. That then does beg the question, what will happen after that, and what will Stormont do if it faces a major budgetary dilemma as to, does it maintain farming subsidies at the existing level, or does it, for example, cut back spending by other departments to fund such spending? But that, of course, is a medium-term challenge. There is, of course, a strategic review of the sector, which has just started. Of course, it also has to factor in the important implications of the Brexit protocol and any potential free trade agreements that the UK may be able to strike with Australia, United States, or wherever. And there's, of course, something of a question of how far Northern Ireland will be within the terms of those FTAs in any case. Another sector, life and health sciences. Now, this obviously includes pharmaceuticals, but it's much broader than that. And here again, as the Department for the Economy and others have noted, there's a relatively large sector in place. Once again, the pandemic has obviously produced market opportunities, but defined in the way that the official statisticians define, particularly pharma or pharmaceutical production and associated health technology. It's a sector characterised by a relatively low level of productivity in Northern Ireland compared to England, Scotland and Wales separately, or indeed probably even more so compared to the Republic of Ireland, although there are some caveats about the measurement of value added in the case of the Republic of Ireland, given the way the tax system influences the behaviour of multinationals. The productivity difference makes me think that there's a difference in the type of activities here in Northern Ireland compared to Great Britain. It's not necessarily comparing like for like, much more of production of diagnostic and test kits here, as opposed to drug design and manufacturing, particularly in England. Now, lastly, in terms of my response to Gareth, and indeed in terms of looking at sectors, I'm going to look at the sector of public administration. Now, this isn't always considered as a sector, but it is important in its own right, and obviously the contribution it makes through delivery of public government policy, and in this case, policy by the Northern Ireland Executive. And Gareth was referring to the hybrid model of office and indeed work from home. And it does look like that's what, to a great extent, the Northern Ireland Civil Service will be doing in the future, a partial, but only a partial return to the office. Now, this presumably is a good thing from the point of view of the civil servants, giving them more choice about where they actually work. It could be a good thing from the point of view of the taxpayer, to the extent that this more flexible approach to location of working does lead to permanent reductions in staff absence levels. Indeed, there's been some evidence even to date that civil service staff absence levels have actually gone down. But it is worth, in passing, noting there are big implications for what you might call the new economic geography of Northern Ireland. Now, a more distributed model of civil servants working from home a certain number of days in the week, maybe going into a sub-regional hub for a certain amount of time, and then for a limited amount of time, in certain cases, going to Belfast or wherever. You could see how that helps to spread activity, spending power across the sub-regions of Northern Ireland. But what do we do? The challenge is, what do we do about the centre of Belfast in particular? Because hitherto, for at least 3 decades, the economic development strategy for the centre of Belfast has been very much based on 2 pillars. Bring in more retail and bring in more offices. And now we're looking at a much more distributed model of where people will be working. Now, finally, let me go back to, in terms of public administration, the machinery of government question. And I think very importantly, even before the pandemic struck in March of last year, there was accumulating evidence that the Northern Ireland system of public administration was struggling in terms of delivery. In other words, the number of tasks and the complexity of tasks that it was being given was straining the amount of staff and human resource that it had to hand. And I think the evidence for this strain was detected by the OECD in 2016 when they made their report on regional governance in Northern Ireland, and perhaps in an even more sharp forensic sense by Judge Coughlin's inquiry, the public inquiry, independent inquiry, as to what had happened during the RHI and why did it happen. So even before the pandemic, there was evidence that the NICS was, in a sense, struggling to either copy or indeed adapt to local circumstances policies relating to what was being done in Great Britain. And of course, to be fair, it has to be said that many commentators would say that the Whitehall civil service has not always had a very great track record in terms of delivery of complex public policy. We've got a string of reports going all the way back to the Fulton Commission in, I think, 1968. Making such criticisms of the London civil service. But what I'm saying is there's a particular regional Northern Ireland challenge on top of that. Some of this challenge, particularly during the pandemic, has been evidenced by formidable levels of staff vacancies. We see that particularly in the department which is perhaps most relevant to our discussion this afternoon, the Department for the Economy. So in 2016, we got a draft programme for government for Northern Ireland. Then, of course, we had the 3-year pause in devolution, the new decade, new approach document or agreement of January of last year committed to an update. And what's been proposed is very, very ambitious. In a sense, that's why I have concerns. Above the draft PFG or the BFG, there is to be the high-level outcomes framework. And then below that, you get the mass of specific targets, indicators, and delivery plans coming through the devolved departments and their agencies. Now, quite apart from practicalities such as, is there now enough time before the next Assembly election scheduled for May of next year? And of course, this obviously more of a political question. That election might be brought forward, who knows? But even if it isn't, there's not much time left. But quite apart from such a practicality question, I wonder if a very complex PFG, along with the outcomes framework and along with the massive delivery plans, is now, post-pandemic, something of a policy bridge too far. Let me use this analogy. From a technology point of view, going back to thinking about aerospace here, you might say, oh, well, let's go for the best piece of technology. Let's have a Concorde to travel around the world. But, you know, a Boeing 747 would be much cheaper and works equally as well. And I'm saying that perhaps in terms of planning for public admin and the delivery of policy, the Stormont executive should be more in a world of Boeing 747 than trying to go for the great leap forward into supersonic travel. And I do wonder if, in fact, what the executive should be doing, not just in the time that remains in this mandate, but even in the early stage of the next mandate after the next election, all being well, is aim for a very short list of objectives. So 5 to 10, including things like improving productivity, getting waiting lists down, doing something about economic inactivity, but a short 10 objectives, 5 to 10. That would be perhaps quite enough given the strain which is already on the system and the strain which undoubtedly is going to continue to grow on the system. But thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you for Gareth and his comments, and hand now back to the chair. Thank you, Duncan.
Thanks, Esmond. And that was very helpful, useful start for a conversation now. I think I might be echoing, so I will see what I can do about that. Just to remind everybody about the chat, and please do put your questions into the chat and we'll try and fit them into this conversation. But if I start with a question to both of you, and maybe Gareth first, which is, at the end of this, has the economy survived better than was feared or anticipated 15 months ago? Are we ending up in a place which is changed, but not as dramatically changed as was feared in when we first started this?
Yeah, that's a good question, Duncan. I mean, I think that we have to come back and recognise that this recession is a very different recession from all previous recessions, certainly in living memory. So all previous recessions were caused by some sort of fundamental weakness in the structure of the economy. So the last recession, there was a financial crisis. Recessions before, we had high inflation, which resulted in the government's putting interest rates up to control inflation, but that in turn created a reduction in economic growth. So we've had an economic cause to previous recessions. This recession was caused by a government mandated shutdown in response to a health crisis. And so that's what meant that we went into this recession without that significant economic weakness that we have gone into previous recessions on. So that's the first point. I think the second point is that the government policy response to this recession has been very different to previous recessions. And by that, I mean, if we take the last, again, if we just go back to the last financial crisis, but we can look at several previous recessions, the government response to those recessions was to move as quickly as possible to balance the books. And so as the economy was slowing down, there were fiscal drags put on the economy as well. Globally, not just locally in Northern Ireland or nationally across the UK, but globally, governments took a very different approach to dealing with the economic fallout of this recession. And that has been in terms of protecting jobs, trying to keep businesses afloat, etc. And the huge stimulus packages that were put in place just to stop the economy collapsing initially. And Esmond made reference in his comments to the subsequent very significant stimulus packages that the US government, for example, Joe Biden is putting in place in the US. So the government spending has been much greater this time than in previous times, and I think that has really undoubtedly kept the economy going at a much stronger pace than would have been the case had they taken a more traditional approach, if you like, to government or to the response to recessions. So how the government has responded, I think, is the fundamental difference this time. And yes, I mean, I wouldn't be lying if I have to be honest when I say, you know, I was one of the people who was indicating that unemployment could go very significantly out of control if things like the furlough scheme hadn't been extended beyond September, October, November last year, and that still would have happened if we hadn't extended it. So yes, I think we are. The economy is in better shape now than we absolutely anticipated it would be, but we're sitting with very high levels of public debt and public borrowing to keep the economy there. And that's my concern in terms of potential higher inflation, and Esmond talked about it as well. If we have higher inflation, we also have higher interest rates. High interest rates and high government deficits are not good for global growth.
Anything to add to that, Esmond?
Thanks, Duncan. Not very much. I agree with what Gareth has just said, and it's the usual situation of the glass is half full or half empty. It compares what perspective you take on it. So if you go back to March of last year, as an economist, I would have been one of the ones saying that we could well be seeing a reduction in Northern's economic output of 12, 13, 14, even 15%. Which would be horrible. As it turned out, and Gareth and his colleagues have produced an estimate or forecast that last year the economy declined size by 10.4%. So it's not been as bad as initially we feared, and Gareth has outlined some of the reasons why. But equally, even a decline of 10 or more percent, which was slightly worse than the UK average situation, is in historical terms astounding and astoundingly bad, and probably worse than the Great Depression of the early 1930s. And you probably need to go back to the situation immediately after the First World War. There was a recession in 1920-21 that was very bad, albeit of very short duration. So it depends on the perspective you take, but hopefully now we are in a bounce back. It will be a rapid recovery, but that's a reflection of just how far we fell backwards last year.
Inflation has been something that you have both flagged up as being something to watch, something we haven't seen, as you say, much for the last 25 years, something which, because of all of this stored up and rapid growth, is the debt that has arisen from furlough and from COVID government debt and the advent of a higher rate of inflation, is that a dangerous conjunction? Is that something that we should watch, that governments have become, or is that historic debt secured at a lower level and now, and so we can relax about that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm sure, Esmond, you have views on this too. I think that let me take a step back. First of all, I know we are both talking about inflation. Our medium-term forecast for inflation is still relatively benign. We do think it will fall back broadly within the Bank of England's target range. So I think that's the first point to bear in mind. It's now something that we're watching much more closely than we would have been before. In turn, well, there's a couple of things that I would say about government debt. First of all, a huge proportion of that government debt is now held by the Bank of England. And they could, if they wanted to, recycle that. So in other words, that public debt doesn't get released back onto the market until a time that they feel it's appropriate to do so. So the interest rate on that debt. It gets paid to the Bank of England and then it gets sent back to Treasury again. So it's an interest-free loan from the Bank of England in effect. The profile of the other debt, the debt that is in public investors' hands, if you like, that from a UK perspective, that's not bad. That has been reasonably well managed by the Debt Management Office. In that, only a small amount will become will need to be refinanced or repaid in the short term. Some other countries are in a much more precarious situation where quite a high proportion within the European Union with quite a high proportion of their public debt falling due in the short term, and trying to find a private sector investor to take that at an affordable rate of interest will be a challenge. Now you've asked a good question, because that's one point about the stock of debt that we currently owe. But even the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, are only forecasting that we'll get back, I think, to about 60 or 70 billion pounds of a deficit in 24-25. Now that's still higher than what they were forecasting for 2021 prior to the pandemic. So we're still going to be borrowing huge sums of money over the next 3 or 4 years, albeit bringing it back down to levels that are much more affordable. And it's how that gets financed over the next 3, 4, 5 year period that's going to be a challenge too.
Yeah, I agree with what Gareth's saying there, and you're right, Duncan, to raise, as you put it, the conjunction of possibly higher inflation leading to higher interest rates and the very high level of debt. And Gareth is right that thankfully, to some degree, the UK, in terms of public debt, it's got a so-called long maturity period before it falls due, but those maturity periods have shortened in recent years, and therefore the vulnerability to any in the short to medium term future increase in Bank of England and other interest rates, that vulnerability is increasing steadily over time, and it is something we should keep a watchful eye on.
One of the other obvious big issues is this issue that, and you quoted something in your talk, Gareth, which was quoted elsewhere, about this all in the same storm but all in different boats, that actually was used in a previous one as well. So it's clear that we understand that. But young people, again, and this is the previous speaker was talking about mental health, seem to be at the forefront of this. So my question to you is do you anticipate a long-term generational impact on young people economically as a result of the COVID thing? Is that something we should be paying attention to, or is it something which will bounce back and which over time will be seen as an episode?
I think that's a really good question, and it's something that we can't discount. There will be a relatively small group, but still a significant number of people that will be impacted by this in the long term. We have a generation, or we've got a 2, 3, 4 year cohort of young people who have had towards the end of their education period significantly impacted by COVID, whether it's young people in higher education or further education who have missed out on a practical work placement, internship, or apprenticeship opportunity. So they do not have this, they didn't have the same access to the same skills development that their peers would have had 1, 2, 3 years earlier. In addition to that, we will have younger people of school age who, particularly from more disadvantaged backgrounds, whose parents are, for whatever reason, less inclined, less able, have a lower level capability to engage in homeschooling. So there will be a bigger differential between those groups that would probably have been marginalised in any case, but they are now more marginalised as a result of COVID, because the the social support structure around them isn't at the same level as in other areas. So I think that we will see, as I say, it'll be relatively small in percentage terms, but it's still going to be a significant number of young people that could, I don't want to say permanently damaged for the rest of their lives, but it's certainly for a long period of time. It's something that could take a 5 to 10 year time horizon to work through to bring them back to where they otherwise would have been.
And as you point out, the conjunction of low skill and age may create some significant social issues as we go forward. Esmond, are you aware of whether any studies have been carried out? This is from the chat on productivity, comparing working from home and office working. Is there any evidence that we're actually working better from home or worse from home?
Yes, I don't know if there's been much what you might call very intense data-driven academic research, but there's been a lot of commentary on this, and I think gradually we're obviously learning more as time goes on. Initially, I suppose during the pandemic, there was perhaps a view that there were a lot of advantages. People didn't have to spend time commuting and so forth, and all of that, in a sense, might actually contribute to improve performance. But latterly, and Gareth was alluding to some of this, there's been more emphasis on the negatives. And a few months back, Andy Haldane, the outgoing chief economist at the Bank of England, he was stressing that from the point of view of promoting creativity, and creativity in turn is probably intrinsically a very useful and valuable thing, but it has all sorts of spin-off economic benefits, creating innovation, better company performance, better personal performance, etc., etc. He was saying creativity very much depends on social interaction, indeed face-to-face social interaction. So I have a lot of sympathy with Haldane's view. So that would be saying maybe on balance, it is going to turn out negative, but as I say, it's probably too early to expect much. I don't think we've got definitive, hard statistical evidence that could be so, but perhaps pointers in that direction.
I think just to add to that as well, Duncan, dare I say it, the three of us and people of our age, us working from home is something that we can do relatively easy. We've got the sort of job that lends itself to that, but we're at a stage in our career where our professional networks are well developed. We are at a level in the organisation where we're self-sufficient. We don't need training to do our job. We don't need a lot of supervision. If you have a lot of young people who are starting out in their career and all of a sudden they're working from their bedroom, they do not have that ability or opportunity to develop those important professional and social networks that they will then subsequently use as their career progresses. So they're missing out on that, and they're missing out on watching and how their more senior peers behave and learning those soft skills from your senior colleagues and training and development opportunities that you just get from being in the office and being close proximity to people. So
seem to have lost you there, Gareth. Just
oh, sorry. So yeah, basically, I think that
we lost you there in your sound. Sorry about that. I'm going to ask a question, Alison Miller. I apologise if I've overlooked your question. It's my fault entirely. There's actually two questions almost in this one. One of which relates to skills shortages, and one of which relates to economic inactivity. So I'll ask the economic activity one first, which is the inactivity rate in Northern Ireland may have risen to about 30%. Is this something that is new and COVID related, one side, but it's worrying? Why are we so out of kilter still with the rest of the UK and Ireland on economic inactivity? Maybe Esmond, take that one.
Yeah, thanks very much. Very good question, and I think the answer is it's not entirely a new, and it's not necessarily a COVID related. In fact, it probably isn't a COVID thing because it predates COVID. So even before the pandemic, in broad terms, 5 or 6 percentage points higher here compared to the UK average. So there perhaps was a long-run tendency over the last decade for economic inactivity to gradually fall, but it was happening both NI and GB. The gap remained substantial. Why is that so? Well, that's a very good question, and I'm tempted to say, and especially some of Gareth's colleagues are doing some very good research in this area, but it seems to be something of a structural weakness in the way the Northern Ireland labour market operates, and there aren't easy policy solutions.
Yeah, just have you got my volume back? Yeah,
yeah, we've got your sound back. Yeah.
So basically, there's 4 groups that make up. There's 4 groups that make up economic inactivity. So you've got students, you've got those who are looking after the family. So what would traditionally have been the housewife, although it's much broader now. You've got people who have retired early; they're in a position to retire early, and then you've got what are called long-term sick. So people who aren't looking for work because they've long-term sick. Whenever you compare Northern Ireland with the rest of the UK. 3 out of the 4 are broadly similar. The one standout difference is the long-term sick, and we would have traditionally, it's about 6% in the UK. In Northern Ireland, it's about 10 or 11%. We would have historically put that down to troubles-related issues, but we're now, sort of 25 plus years past the troubles, but we are not making inroads to that long-term sickness issue. I think that's the fundamental difference. And those the groups of people that are long-term sick tend to be in geographic pockets. And so it's about finding policy solutions that address deprivation in those specific areas.
Okay, well, we're coming to the end. I'm going to ask, and there are a lot of questions on the chat. One about the green economy and the potential for that as a future development activity, and about skills shortages. But I want to ask you just a closing question about the importance of research and where research in this area now we need to do more really to understand where we should go from here. What would be important to put in place to help us recover from COVID?
Well, Duncan, if I'll jump in. Well, one thing I think very important is management capabilities and skills. We've got a number of studies over the years suggest that Northern Ireland has an issue compared to a number of other Western, indeed some non-Western economies too. So I would suggest that's an area where some policy, but there should be more, and also talking about research. Research on the behaviour of individual firms is always very helpful. You want to look at firms which are doing well, learn lessons from them in Northern Ireland, but also look at the average and below average performing firms in Northern Ireland and ask why are they so.
Gareth, last word.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I was on a 10X, that's the Department for the Economy's new strategy, and part of that is about trying to develop the skills that are needed to make people more sustainably literate, and also to address long-term environmental sustainability issues moving forward. So it's about having an appropriately skilled workforce to be able to, one, identify what's the sustainability issues within individual firms, but also at a more macro level, and then putting in place the measures to solve those problems.
Thank you both very much. We have run out of time, and this has been another very interesting session. Thanks for all your work, and thank you for putting the effort into thinking around this.